and yet another sexual harassment suit for Fox News.
Caution.
And more allegations about its highest profile star.
I simply said, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
When All In starts right now.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. In a stunning turn of events, Senate Democrats now have enough votes to filibuster the president's first Supreme Court nominee and are now poised to block what was supposed to be an easy victory for the Trump administration after a string of major setbacks. According to conventional wisdom in Washington, the president's nomination of Judge Neil Gorsuch was a home run. Just about the one thing all Republicans could agree on amid conflicts over dismantling Obamacare and advancing tax cuts. For the president himself, this confirmation was supposed to provide a much-needed win after a series of losses. From the death of the health care bill in just a few weeks, his first major legislative effort, to the holdup of both travel bans in federal court, to the revelation that his campaign is under FBI investigation for possible links to Russia. Now, Democrats are standing in the way, and it's up to Senate Republicans either to accept defeat or to change Senate rules and kill the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees. This morning, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted to approve Gorsuch along party lines, advancing his nomination to the full Senate. That came as Delaware Senator Chris Coons became the 41st Democrat to announce he'd support a filibuster, crossing the threshold needed to successfully block a confirmation vote. Republicans from the White House to Capitol Hill expressed their outrage.
This isn't about voting against somebody or having an issue with them.
I'm very disappointed in my colleagues to politicize this the way they have.
When you win the White House, you have the ability to appoint people to the Supreme Court.
And all they can come up with are facts that have absolutely nothing to do with his qualifications as a jurist.
They are opposed to Donald Trump appointing anyone to the Supreme Court.
Neil Gorsuch is a good man. He's been a good judge on the 10th Circuit.
It's the Democrats who are breaking the rules because what they're doing is changing a 200-year status quo.
The irony, of course, is that you could have said the exact same things, maybe just switching out the names, regarding Judge Merrick Garland. That, of course, was President Obama's nominee to fill the same vacant seat on the Supreme Court, for whom Republicans refused to hold a single confirmation hearing, much less a vote. It was an unprecedented feat of obstruction, which Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell on the campaign trail later called, quote, one of my proudest moments. The Garland affair seems to have taught Democrats a lesson about the upsides of obstructionism. And now, with an engaged base marching the streets and turning up at town halls, showing they oppose any kind of cooperation whatsoever with this president, there is a new political calculus in Washington. Just 4 Democratic senators came out against a Gorsuch filibuster, all but one of them from red states facing tough re-election battles next year. Republicans have vowed to confirm Gorsuch by the end of the week when the Senate adjourns for a 2-week recess. But with Democrats ready to filibuster, they now face a choice: either take the loss or change the rules to make it impossible to filibuster Supreme Court nominees. It's known colloquially as the nuclear option. And according to Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Republicans don't have to go that far.
They don't have to treat the nuclear option as if it's their first and only option. It's a false choice. To my friends on the other side, the answer isn't to change the rules. It's their first and only option. It's a false choice. To my friends on the other side, the answer isn't to change the rules. The answer is to change the nominees.
Joining me now, Democratic Senator Mazie Hirono of Hawaii, a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Senator, I want you to...
We have a lot of substantive objections against Judge Gorsuch. It has to do with, after reviewing his cases and how he approaches his judicial decisions, there's a pattern that shows that he is very much in favor of corporations over individual rights. He will fit right in with the Roberts Court and send this court further to the right in ways that will not protect minority rights.
But is there any, I mean, the argument, I think, from Republicans is that essentially there would be no Republican nominee that would pass your threshold. Is that a fair objection?
No, it's not. In fact, if there were a nominee that had not been hand-selected by the Heritage Foundation and the conservative groups who spent, by the way, over $10 million trying to get Judge Gorsuch to this point, I would be open to someone who is not going to be totally on the page with these kinds of most conservative organizations in our country. They know what they're getting with Judge Gorsuch. That's our objection.
How much of this is about Merrick Garland? It just seems like that's a bell that cannot be unrung.
I'm not upset with Neil Gorsuch because of how Merrick Garland was treated, awful as that was.
Really?
In fact, nobody told.
Is that honestly true, Senator?
I mean, I'm not happy.
I have a hard time believing that.
I'm not happy, but this is not a quid pro quo or a tit for tat. No, we have our own reasons. I certainly have my own reasons, along with my Democratic colleagues on the committee, why we object to Justice, well, soon to be, I guess. I hope not. Gorsuch. It is because of the kind of positions he takes, where he goes out of his way to find the most narrow ways to interpret a law or provision so that a minority person is harmed.
Let me ask you this. When this started, I felt like the folks I talked to on the Hill, even in just sort of on background chats, thought that this would go through. They didn't think the Democrats would get enough votes to filibuster. Trace for me the trajectory here among you and your colleagues in terms of how you got to this point.
I certainly waited until after the hearings, but part of the whole process of the hearings, 4 days of it, was for us to try to find out what his judicial philosophy was, because of course that makes a difference. If judicial philosophy didn't make a difference, we wouldn't have so many 5-4, or at this point 4-4 Supreme Court decisions. That's because our justices come with life experiences and various perspectives. He would not give us an inkling as to how he would view laws. He just kept saying he would follow precedent. He is going to the one court that sets precedent. So it was not reassuring at all. So we looked at his record, we looked at his decisions. Hobby Lobby, where all of a sudden very expanded rights for a corporation to have religious rights over the rights of thousands of employees, female employees of Hobby Lobby, who suddenly were not going to get this kind of insurance coverage. So that was Judge Gorsuch.
So respond to an alternate theory of what happened here. What I'm hearing from you, you're saying, look, this is a substantive decision that I've come to, my colleagues have come to on the merits. It's about his judicial philosophy and his performance in hearings. Yes. Another way of viewing this is there was tremendous organized pressure put on Democratic senators, and particularly by the activist base, that felt like any vote for this seat is a stolen seat, it's fundamentally illegitimate, and that pressure worked.
I certainly didn't feel any pressure from my base. I think that is a kind of an argument that some people like to make. In fact, my colleague from Texas, Ted Cruz, said that the Democrats on the committee were afraid of being primaried, and I said at the markup that that kind of a statement doesn't even deserve any kind of response. It's so ridiculous. You know, we asked serious questions of Judge Gorsuch, and he did not provide us with the kind of responses that would enable us to conclude that he would be a justice for all of us and not just some of us.
All right, Senator. Sorry,
I could go on.
Finish your thought, Senator. Well, it's going to be interesting. We may get a chance to talk more about this, depending on how this shakes out in the week ahead. Senator Mazie Hirono, thank you very much.
Thank you. Aloha.
I'm joined now by Brian Darling, former communications director, Senator Rand Paul, and Jim Manley, former chief spokesperson to then Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid. Brian, there's one way of looking at this, which is that, like, you know, God is dead, all is permitted, all of the pretense has been stripped away, and the McConnell strategy adopted in 2009, obstruction by any means, that it was a kind of learned it from watching you, Dad moment, right? If he was able to pull off the Garland gambit, which was so amazingly audacious, then why not try obstruction by any means?
Well, I mean, Mitch McConnell does have the power to get this nominee passed, and he can thank Harry Reid for that. Harry Reid was the one that set the table for this. He could also thank people like you, Chris Hayes, because you as a progressive have been very vocal in your support for filibuster reform.
Oh,
you should be cheering Mitch McConnell for doing this.
Let me be clear. I think the filibuster is an anti-democratic procedural mechanism that is nowhere in the Constitution. It was not envisioned by the founders, and I think as a sort of selective thing, it's fine. But let's just look at the the numbers, Brian, just to be clear here on the empirical skyrocketing of the filibuster, which became essentially a de facto supermajority in one of the houses, which is nowhere in the constitutional architecture. And we all know how much you and everyone loves originalism. This is Obama just in his first 4 years. That's just the first term. 307 filibusters compared to 130 for George W. Bush. There's just nothing like it. So if it becomes a de facto, supermajority invocation, yeah, like I think they should kill it.
Yeah, but senators are lazy. I mean, to be honest, the way that I think this should happen, I am not a fan of the nuclear option. I'm not happy about the Senate traditions being chipped away. I think this is a terrible thing. But I understand why it's happening. It's happening because Harry Reid exempted everything except for the Supreme Court with his breaking the rules to change the rules. So I get why that's happening. But I would rather see a real talking filibuster. I'd rather Mitch McConnell say, you know what? You want to block this nominee? Right. Let's see you guys get down to the Senate floor and talk for 24 and 48 hours.
I mean, this was, Jim, you were in the square parts of these debates. And you guys, I should say, wrote a letter together, or wrote an op-ed together saying you shouldn't filibuster. My understanding, Jim, is you have now come around to think they should filibuster here.
That's in fact correct. I've reluctantly come to the decision after a lot of thought that this is absolutely the right thing to go. For me, with all due respect to the senator, it absolutely has almost everything to do with how they treated Merrick Garland. They refused to give this good man even the courtesy of a hearing. And now for them to say all these crocodile tears about what happened is absolutely ridiculous. So you and I have been talking about this for years, Chris. I have been very reluctant to change the rules of the Senate. But I think that this is absolutely the right thing to do by Senator Schumer, and I applaud the caucus for holding together. And what I want to talk about is how did these Democrats get to this place where they felt comfortable voting against this nominee?
Jim, I'm actually shocked. I have to say, I think, and obviously Senator Hirono says this was sort of a substantive judgment on the merits, and I'm not going to question her on that. But when you look at that whip count, I mean, what's your answer to that, having been inside Harry Reid's office?
And I understand, again, why the senator said that. But the fact of the matter is that if you look at the House, you look what happened to so-called Trump care, anyone who's afraid of getting on the wrong side of a Trump tweet storm right now needs to get a new job, because at 36% approval rating, unable to move a legislative agenda, obviously a whole bunch of these Democrats feel very comfortable in taking this stand at this point in time. And I got to tell you, a couple weeks ago, like you, I thought this was going to happen and he was going to be confirmed. But obviously, the handwriting's on the wall and it's not going to happen.
But it's laughable. It really is laughable when Chuck Schumer goes on the Senate floor and says, we need a new nominee. He knows that isn't going to happen.
Wait,
and
why
he
not?
supported changing the rules.
Wait a second. Why not? I thought it was laughable when Mitch McConnell said Merrick Garland isn't even going to get any meetings. Remember, the initial idea was not only was he not going to get a hearing, we won't look the guy in the face, okay? When he said that, I thought that's laughable. I
think that was perfectly defensible, because look, the Constitution says that the Senate has the right to advise and consent.
Right, but that's exactly what the Democrats are doing right now. They are withdrawing their consent. I said this to senator after senator and Republican after Republican. They said, yes, advise and consent means not giving our consent. Democrats are not giving their consent to go forward to a vote. That is part of advise and consent.
No, because they don't have enough votes to block it.
Absolutely, Brian. That's ridiculous.
Brian, that's definitionally the case.
They do not have enough votes. They do have enough votes to filibuster. Yes. And the problem is that they changed the rules and set the table for this. They're the ones that said, hey, let's get rid of the filibuster in every nomination by the Supreme Court. But it's logical to understand that this was inevitably going to happen.
But this is the thing that drives me crazy. Everybody just has to pretend all of these, everyone, I mean, I just watched Cornyn and all these folks be like, oh my God, the expressions of just sadness that we've come here. This is just so upsetting. And the politicization by our Democratic colleagues, gosh, I don't know what happened. They blocked Merrick Garland for an entire year. They made up some ridiculous ex nihilo rule about the final year of a president's term, which, again, appears nowhere in the Constitution, appears nowhere in tradition. And that's fine. They won that battle. But why should anyone pretend that it's anything but a Hobbesian struggle of sheer will to power, of what you can pull off, Jim? Why should anyone pretend there's anything more than that?
They shouldn't. I mean, it's the crocodile tears coming out of the Senate Republicans at this point in time. It really takes a cake. And I hope just Democrats are realizing that these guys aren't playing by the same rules as Democrats do, and it's about time to try and fight fire with fire.
And so, Brian here, the ultimate, quickly on this, are they going to get the votes to pull off the nuclear option?
I think they will. I think they will because we saw Democrats hold the line. I think they only lost 3 Democrats in that vote for Harry Reid's use of the nuclear option in 2013. I assume the Republicans will stick together.
All right, Brian Darling and Jim Manley, thank you both. Coming up, reports of an attempted back-channel connection between Putin and President Trump as the House Intel Committee gets back to work on their investigation, leaving the White House desperate for a diversion. We'll talk about it all after this 2-minute break. Another day, another detailed report about the possible connections between Trump associates and Russia. NBC News has now confirmed the Washington Post report that according to U.S., European, and Arab officials, the United Arab Emirates arranged a secret meeting this January between Blackwater founder Eric Prince and a Russian close to President Vladimir Putin as part of an apparent effort to establish a back-channel line of communication between Moscow and President-elect Donald Trump. It should be noted that Eric Prince is the brother of Betsy DeVos, the president's education secretary. And right now, the question of whether the president's associates worked together inappropriately with Russian officials to interfere in the 2016 election is being investigated by the FBI, along with the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. That latter committee met tonight for the first time since its Republican chairman, Devin Nunes, made his midnight run to the White House. The Trump administration, for its part, has responded to these investigations with a counter-narrative, claiming the real scandal is that Trump associates were the ones secretly spied on by the Obama administration. Today, it became clear that counter-narrative would involve Obama National Security Advisor Susan Rice. The story was first written up by a marginal figure on the far right in a piece titled "Susan Rice Requested Unmasking of Incoming Trump Administration Officials," then turned up on Fox and Friends this morning, where they called the whole thing, quote, unprecedented. Moments later, the president, apparently live tweeting the entirety of the show, said, Fox News from multiple sources, there was electronic surveillance of Trump and people close to Trump. This is unprecedented. Then a short time after that, Bloomberg columnist Eli Lake published a piece suggesting that Rice was the person who had requested the identities of Trump transition officials whose phone conversations with foreign officials were collected incidentally. Joining me now is Susan Hennessy, former attorney in the Office of General Counsel of the National Security Agency. All right, it's very clear to me now you've got sort of all of the parts of the, let's say, the Benghazi industrial complex, let's call it, is sort of working to send this idea that the real scandal here is the Obama folks spying on the Trump campaign. What do you make of it?
Right, so again and again, they're sort of trying to advance this narrative that the real story is something else, leaks, the fact of incidental collection, now potentially sort of this unmasking. The issue is really that they're describing perfectly legal and what appears to be proper conduct of intelligence activities. So the question really becomes either they're advocating for major intelligence reforms, right, a pretty dramatic departure from the traditional Republican position on these issues, or these are potentially being offered sort of as an attempt to distract from the real story here. Yeah, so I want to talk about the unmasking. I think it's worth sort of getting to the weeds for a moment, right? There's something called minimization, and minimization exists because you want to protect the privacy of American persons when you are surveilling foreign entities. So if that foreign entity has a conversation with an American person, it's minimized or masked. Senior intelligence officials, including, say, the National Security Advisor, can request to unmask to say, oh, who's the American on the other side of that conversation? If it is the case that Susan Rice did that in these contexts, is that okay? Is that not okay? What do you make of that? Right, so this would be sort of within the ordinary activity of a national security advisor. Typically what occurs with minimization is a generic identifier is replaced, right? So it'll say U.S. person number 1. In some cases, it'll even be sort of the title, especially in the case of a government official. So sometimes that information will be disseminated out with that generic identifier. In some cases, the senior officials that are receiving that information will say, hey, in order to understand the foreign intelligence value, the significance and meaning of this intelligence, I need need more information. In that case, they'll make a request of NSA in order to provide that additional information. It would be within sort of the ordinary job of the National Security Advisor. Also, NSA would be making a separate determination as to whether or not it met those requirements before actually performing the unmasking.
I mean, I kept sort of running through the thought experiment here. It's like I'm Susan Rice and I read some intelligence product that says foreign intelligence, someone that we're spying on, who's a member of agent of a foreign government, had conversation with, you know, U.S. person campaign official A, and I kept thinking to myself, well, I think I'd want to know who that was. And that doesn't seem crazy.
Right, so it's not crazy. You wouldn't be able to unmask information just as a matter of personal curiosity. It's really about whether or not you need that information in order to perform your official duty. And so that standard is a relatively high one, but it's one that a relatively limited number of people are allowed to make it, and there are external checks and controls on when that information is actually allowed to be distributed.
So I don't know if you have thoughts on this. You are in a position like all of us, sort of sorting through the kind of steady barrage of information. This new Washington Post reporting tonight about Erik Prince trying to set up a back channel in the Seychelles, a 2-day meeting apparently with someone close to Putin, and we know that Erik Prince, from some of the reporting Jeremy Scahill's done that was in The Intercept, is close to the Trump orbit. Well, how does that strike you?
Right, so once again, sort of the bizarre feature here really does seem to be the secrecy, right? So there's nothing necessarily improper about an incoming administration wanting to communicate with foreign governments, including Russia, right? We've seen past administration have talked about resets and pivots. What is strange here, and has been strange in the past, is the secrecy and sort of obfuscation, why you would sort of dispatch this unofficial individual, somebody who's not part of the transition team, in order to establish that back channel communication. Why you wouldn't be forthright, especially sort of considering all the news stories. That is what really sort of raises suspicions about what is there to hide here.
Why all the back channel? Susan Hennessy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Rob.
Ahead, new revelations that President Trump secretly revised his so-called blind trust, allowing him to take money from any of his businesses whenever he feels like it. That story coming up. We now have yet another revelation of ethically questionable behavior by Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price. Now, previous reporting has shown that while in Congress, Price purchased shares in a medical device manufacturer shortly before introducing legislation that would have benefited the company, traded hundreds of thousands of dollars in stock of health-related companies while sponsoring and advocating legislation affecting those companies, and got a sweetheart deal on stock from an Australian biotech firm that netted Price a cool 400% profit. Republicans in Congress knew all this about Price, and they confirmed him to lead the Department of Health and Human Services anyway. Now, ProPublica reporting that on the very same day that Price's stockbroker bought him up to $90,000 of stock in 6 pharmaceutical companies last year, that same day, Price arranged to call a top U.S. health official seeking to scuttle a controversial rule that could have hurt the firm's profits and driven down their share prices. It's worth remembering that a source had previously told ProPublica that Price's trades were being investigated by the former U.S. attorney for the Southern District of New York, Preet Bharara, before Bharara was abruptly fired by President Trump last month, despite Trump having previously indicated he would keep him in that job. That's just one of the major conflict issues that have cropped up for the Trump White House in the past few days. Next, the White House is denying a report the president made a secret change to his pretend blind trust, and new documents that could spell ethics trouble for Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump, right after this short break.
Going to be running it in a very professional manner. They're not going to discuss it with me.
It turns out that President Trump's pretend blind trust, which the director of the Office of Government Ethics has called, quote, wholly inadequate, is even less legitimate than we thought. ProPublica reporting that previously unreported changes to a trust document signed on February 10th show that Trump can draw money from his more than 400 businesses at any time without disclosing it. And it's not just money. The new language is so broad, he could potentially withdraw entire businesses from the trust, again, without telling the American people. White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer was asked about the ProPublica report at today's press briefing.
I'm not aware that there was any change. Just because a left-wing blog makes the point of something changing doesn't mean it actually happened. I'm not aware that there was ever a change in the trust. And the idea that the president is withdrawing money at some point is exactly the purpose of what the trust, why a trust is set up, regardless of an individual.
So, just last question on this. So you're not saying whether or not it has changed, just to clarify. You're not sure whether...
No, I'm actually, to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't changed.
There's a lot to fact check here. One, ProPublica is not a left-wing blog. Two, a trust that you can just withdraw money from and assets from whenever you want is not actually a trust. And three, the Trump Trust doc was in fact revised and signed on February 10th, as ProPublica pointed out to Spicer on Twitter. It now stipulates that it shall distribute net income or principal to Donald J. Trump at his request. This is just one of the revelations we've gotten about Trump administration conflicts in the past few days. Here to discuss Trump's trust and many other ethical issues facing the administration, Richard Painter, chief White House ethics lawyer for President George W. Bush. And Mr. Painter, my understanding is that actual blind trusts have mechanisms to disperse money, but in this case, it was never a blind trust to begin with, and now it's been further amended without letting anyone know.
Well, yes, this trust was never a blind trust. This trust did absolutely nothing to remove conflicts of interest, and I don't think anybody who knows anything about conflict of interest law ever thought that it removed conflicts. This is a trust set up to benefit Donald Trump and to allow him to do whatever he wants with the assets when he wants. That's clearly what's going on. A qualified blind trust is one under the Ethics in Government Act where the office holder transfers the assets to the trustee. The trustee then sells the conflict-creating assets, tells the office holder the assets have been sold, and then invests in something else without the office holder knowing about it. But that has nothing to do with this trust. This trust is simply there to be a vehicle to hold Donald Trump's businesses until he is done being president.
I want to ask you about some of the disclosures we got on Friday from the Office of Government Ethics, and particularly about two people that are working in the administration, the president's daughter Ivanka and her husband Jared. New York Times saying Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner still benefiting from business empire filing show. And what strikes me as important here is the conflict of interest laws may not apply directly to the president in the way that, criminal exposure and the like, but it certainly should apply to people like Jared Kushner and Ivanka, right? How big of a problem is it that they have all of this potential exposure?
Well, it does. The criminal statute does apply, the conflict of interest law. The White House counsel's office tried to wiggle around that for about 2 weeks, calling Ivanka a volunteer, but they knew full well that wasn't going to fly. I wrote them a letter, and I think Ivanka's lawyer was telling her she better comply with the conflict of interest statutes, and so they decided, well, let's make her a real employee. She is subject to this law, and so is Jared, and that means they're going to have to stay out of banking, financial services regulation, because that affects real estate. They're going to have to stay out of tax reform because there are lots of goodies for real estate in the tax code. And, of course, trade with Ivanka importing clothing from China. And so if they stay out of those three areas, I guess there's something else for them to do. But this is a very, very broad recusal. In most White Houses, they would insist that someone sell off at least some of those businesses. She has no need to be importing clothing, putting her name on it when she's in the White House. She should have gotten rid of that business.
But I just want to be clear here, because there are criminal statutes applying to conflict of interest. You've just sketched out very broad areas that they would have a requirement to recuse themselves from, including things like tax reform, which is a huge legislative priority apparently for the president, and trade. I mean, what would happen if we found out definitively that either of them were working on issues that directly affect their bottom line?
That would be referred to the criminal division of the Department of Justice. There's a public integrity unit over there with a lot of experienced career lawyers. So this is not something that Attorney General Sessions would be able to sweep under the rug. In those types of matters, you have a lot of other people participating. And if you see Jared Kushner or Ivanka Trump getting anywhere close to matters that affect their financial interest, you can bet a lot of people are going to be calling over to the Justice Department. This is a manageable conflict. But I hope they're relying on their own lawyer, who is a lot better than the lawyers in the White House, who, as I say, 2 weeks ago, were trying to pretend that Ivanka Trump wasn't even a government employee. It is a very broad recusal, and they're going to have to stay out of a lot of things. China is one, for example, because President Trump, every time he doesn't like something China does, he threatens trade sanctions. Well, right then and there, Jared and Ivanka may have to walk out of the room if she's importing clothes from China.
This seems, I mean, just from almost self-preservation standpoint, it seems to me like they're putting themselves in a terrible position in terms of exposure. But when you talk about criminal exposure, I want to talk about Tom Price, because Secretary of HHS, we got new information again. This was ProPublica reporting on Friday that he intervened on a rule that would hurt drug profits the same day he acquired some drug stock. He has had a series of allegations of conflict, and we have reporting suggesting he is being investigated possibly by the Southern District of New York.
Well, he's got the conflict of interest problem because of the stock ownership, but he's got another problem as well. If he goes out and buys that stock when he has material non-public information that isn't known to other investors, he could be violating, he is violating insider trading laws, and that's a criminal offense. We send Wall Street people out to jail for that on a regular basis, and congressmen also are prohibited from trading on the basis of non-public information they learned from their work on Capitol Hill. And that episode is very troubling because it was the very same day he made that trade as when he was taking steps that he knew about and other people didn't to help that company. So that is not a good situation.
All right, Richard Painter, thanks for your time.
Thank you.
Still to come, the author of an explosive New York Times report detailing brand new allegations against Bill O'Reilly of Fox News. And today was novelty check day at the White House. Find out what this is all about in tonight's Oh, It's Serious Thing 1, Thing 2 right after this break. Thing 1 tonight, settling up. Last week, Florida lawmakers requested reimbursement for security costs during President Trump's Mar-a-Lago weekends. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Department and Fire Rescue pays $70,000 in overtime each day Trump visits, amounting to $1.7 million to date. Meanwhile, New York City still seeking $18 million spent to secure Trump Tower during the transition. It currently costs the city at least $127,000 a day to protect the First Lady and Barron, who have opted to continue living in Trump Tower. Today, Sean Spicer pushed back on reimbursement.
This is not something that you can control. There is a security aspect that the Secret Service determines when the president and the family travels. That's not dictated by the president of the United States. And third is, I would know, ironically, this is a day that the president just donated a significant amount of money of his salary back to the federal government. And so, respectfully, it's like, it's at what point does he do enough? He just gave a very sizable donation.
I mean, you can't comparably, though. That's a very small.
But that's not how we judge. I mean, I think to be able to say that, he isn't taking a salary. I think he's stepped down from his business. He's walked away from a lot. I think I think at some point he's done quite a bit in terms of making a donation to the government.
At what point does he do enough? It's a good question, and it's Thing 2 in 60 seconds.